Did you know that for over a century, people in Boston have quietly repeated the same rumor that beneath the financial district, there is a hidden freight railway long abandoned by the city? They speak of concrete corridors, narrow gauge tracks, basement loading docks cut directly into century-old foundations, forgotten supply chain sealed off and left to decay. It's the kind of idea that feels plausible, especially in a city as old, layered, and endlessly altered as Boston, but the truth is far stranger. Indeed, the underground freight network was seriously considered. It was planned, it was even engineered and debated, yet it was never actually built. Instead, the rumor survived by attaching itself to the very real, very mysterious underground spaces Boston did construct. I'm talking about the forgotten chambers, sealed subway segments, old basements, ghost stations that still lie below the city. So here's the point. The freight railway myth was propagated by the truth of actual underground tunnel networks. And today, we're going to follow those rumors to uncover the reality of what's really under Boston. I'm your host, Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. In the late 19th century, Boston's colonial-era street grid had become a daily bottleneck. Basically, narrow streets, horse-drawn wagons, and growing commercial pressure all combined to slow the city's economic heart to a crawl. And unfortunately, that reality posed a serious problem for Boston's future, since its commercial district depended on the constant movement of things like coal, produce, dry goods, and newsprint. Hence, when freight stalled, the entire city's economy stalled with it. Considering the severity of that notion, Boston planners understood that something major had to change. The first breakthrough came in 1897 when the city opened the Tremont Street subway, the first underground transit line in the US, and it didn't take long before the surface level thinned out. Streetcars slipped underground, traffic eased, and a new idea emerged almost immediately. If moving people underground solved one crisis, could that same logic work for freight? At the time, freight movement in Boston relied on a messy patchwork of systems. Cargo arrived at the port, then was hauled by wagon into a warehouse district that had outgrown its streets centuries earlier. The rail lines approached from the north and south, but none penetrated the dense commercial core. That last leg, the connection between ship, rail, and merchant, that was the weak link. Wagons could take hours to cross a territory that would otherwise be walked in just minutes. And so the concept of a freight rail took shape. This was to be a narrow-gauge electric railway running beneath the city, linking the waterfront to the financial district, delivering freight directly into basements without ever touching the streets. For this was to be the perfect supply chain. Responsibility for the consideration of this idea fell naturally to the Boston Transit Commission and the Boston Elevated Railway, the same forces behind the Tremont Street subway. And here's what they determined. Their early engineering reports noted that freight didn't require larger passenger tunnels or station platforms. In theory, smaller corridors, electric rails, and simple basement loading bays might have been enough to solve the city's congestion once and for all. And it's here that reality turns to rumors. Yes, engineers drafted alignments and they mapped out potential routes under Atlantic Avenue. Additionally, they sketched portal locations along the waterfront. These were exactly the kind of details that centuries later would fuel speculation. So why didn't they build this in the end? Well, there are a few theories. For example, every proposed alignment ran into obstacles. Seawalls buried under fill, foundations from earlier centuries, unstable soils, active pipes and conduits, as well as the unimaginable cost of underpinning entire blocks without collapsing the buildings above. So the feasibility studies, especially those conducted between 1904 and 1912, laid the groundwork for the story that urban explorers would later retell as, quote, the lost tunnels. But the key fact is this: Boston never approved construction. No tunnels were built, no system was opened, as at its best, this was just a proposal on paper. So now that we have the source of the myth, let's look at the evidence that fuels it. All across Boston's underground, you can find relics, coal chutes, sealed subway passages, forgotten utility corridors, as well as some strange chambers with no clear purpose. And so many have claimed that these must be the old freight tunnels. And that's understandable, since the resemblance of some of these tunnels to the conduits that real freight systems in cities like Chicago pass through is simply uncanny. So now let's head into these spaces one by one and uncover what they really are. One of the most persuasive examples is beneath Fort Point Channel, where enormous brick drainage collectors run under the old waterfront. They're tall, arched, straight, and wide enough for a grown man to walk through. Early urban explorers posted photos claiming that they'd found the abandoned freight lines from the early 1900s, when in truth, these are 1880s storm drains designed to keep the harbor from flooding. They carried water and nothing else, but their scale, their age, well, they made them irresistible candidates to feed the legend. Similar confusion arose when images of the old Central Artery utility tunnels leaked out during the early phases of the Big Dig. In this case, long, straight concrete corridors, some stretching for blocks, appeared briefly in local news coverage and online forums. Immediately, people wondered if these were the remains of the old network, but they weren't. They were mid-20th century service passages for electrical and telecom lines, built decades after the freight plan had already evaporated. That being said, the waterfront offered more fuel for imagination. Under Long Wharf and Central Wharf, reinforced concrete galleries, originally used to carry steam, electric, and telephone lines, extended outward towards the harbor. In that context, because the proposed line was also meant to connect to the docks, these tunnels were repeatedly mislabeled in articles and message boards as the old rail spurs, but once again, that wasn't the case. These were just utilities with a very convenient resemblance to something more dramatic. Heck, even parts of Boston's old steam system played into the myth. Beneath Government Center and Scully Square lie a series of abandoned service tunnels with vast chambers that once housed steam valves and expansion tanks. Construction workers rediscovering these rooms in the 1970s and 80s sometimes assumed that they were indeed freight sidings. And why wouldn't they? The vaulted ceilings and the large industrial fixtures certainly feel like infrastructure meant for movement. And speaking of movement, the MBTA's own maze of ventilation and electrical tunnels has caused similar confusion. These are narrow concrete corridors branching off active subway lines, purely functional and never open to passengers. Yet, on more than one occasion, urban explorers who slipped inside of these spaces and posted them online offer them as proof of the lost freight system. Finally, what about those underground loading docks downtown? Well, since the financial district had extensive sub-basement delivery corridors and coal chutes, complete with steel doors and vaulted sidewalks, many mistook them as underground access points for trains. And this one is fascinating because it demonstrates that the city really did have many underground delivery areas, just not the kind powered by locomotives. The same could be said for misidentification involving the cable conduits beneath Atlantic Avenue and Milk Street, which are long, arched tunnels lined with ceramic brackets for telegraph and telephone wires. Their layout matches almost perfectly with the proposed alignment of the freight railway. And even in the 1970s, there were newspaper articles that mistakenly suggested that these were a part of the old system, but the tunnels never carried anything other than copper. And to further emphasize the point, the brick storm drains beneath State, Broad, and India Street ran almost precisely where the freight line was envisioned, and it could be argued that their vaulted ceilings somewhat closely resemble the engineering drafts of the proposed system. So whenever city workers or explorers would stumble upon one of these drains or utility passages, it was basically inevitable that the rumor would reignite. So in the end, Boston never built its underground freight railway, but the idea of it seemed real because the city has such a layered past. With that being said, Chicago really did build a system like this, and it was 60 miles long in total. We did an entire video on that years ago, which you can check out right now by clicking here. Otherwise, I thank you for watching, and until next time, this is Ryan Sokash signing off.